1970s onward, postmodernism's cultural dominance was confirmed, arguably, by the rapid proliferation of metafictional devices in aesthetic forms both elite and popular. So from anything from Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow in '73 to Terry Gilliam's Monty Python and the Holy Grail in '75 to Jim Henson's The Muppet Show in 1979, the Muppet movie, but the show too, and Gordon Caron's Moonlighting, if you know that, which ran from '85 to '89. And there's hundreds of examples. And yet, somewhat surprisingly, this late century spread of the overtly self-reflexive eventually becomes backdrop to a critical discussion about the waning or the failing efficacy of postmodernism. By the early 2000s, postmodernism is, according to many, a dead episteme. Linda Hutchins' famous 2002 pronouncement being the most famous. And the proliferation of metafiction, especially in popular media, simply stands as the most obvious symptom of a cultural moment that has become, like Yeats's spiraling falcon, too distant or too dispersed from its roots to be of critical or political use. Yet the production of metafiction continued and continues undaunted. In terms of American fiction alone, a list of new metafictionists would certainly include Mark C. Danilewski, Dave Eggers, David Foster Wallace, Mark Lehner, Gary Scheidengart, Percival Everett, Jennifer Egan, Jono Diaz, Salvador Placienza, etc. And again, the list goes on. And today's metafictional films and television shows are almost too numerous and varied to count. As proof, let's consider for just a moment, and it's going to be longer than a moment, but Michael Jelinek and Aaron Horvath's Teen Titans Go, an extremely popular children's program which first aired in 2013. And if you get Netflix, it's on Netflix. I don't know, you're probably not watching it, but it's there. You're going to want to after this. Presented in bright and simplistic animation that might best be described as a parody of America's co-option of anime, Teen Titans Go offers short segments, 2 per 20-minute episode, detailing the exploits of the Teen Titans, a group of young superheroes first introduced in the pages of DC Comics. In many respects, the show is a follow-up to the earlier Teen Titans, which ran from 2003 to 2006, a serious, if also animated, take on the DC heroes. Teen Titans Go, however, is never anything other than a parody. The Teenage Titans, inclusive of Robin, Starfire, Beast Boy, Raven, and Cyborg, there they are, live free of parental supervision in a giant T-shaped tower on a small island outside Jump City. That's their tower. They spend the vast bulk of their time eating pizza, making fart jokes, making jokes about making fart jokes, and annoying one another. They often also break into song or musical numbers, with any number of absurd montages intruding upon the virtually non-existent narratives. A running joke is that the Titans rarely, if ever, fight crime. Alongside these more implicit metafictional conceits, inclusive of satiric references to a larger and often contradictory DC universe and previous adaptations of the Titan characters, the series often takes more explicit metafictional turns. Episode 5 in season 3 is in fact titled The Fourth Wall, and concerns the Titans realizing, after watching on their TV the intro sequence we just watched, that they are an animated TV show, one that, because of its lowbrow nature, is in danger of being rebooted. After attempting to become more mature by getting their creators to draw and write them in a Victorian-esque manner, the Titans finally decide that they have to be true to themselves. That's a quote. We have to be true to ourselves, even if it means being rebooted. After directing a fart song at their TV, the Titans reappear in their previous form, and Robin announces that the Titans are, quote, proud of what they represent, and that if they are to preserve their, quote, truth, they must stop their broadcast by physically, quote, breaking the fourth wall. To do so, Beast Boy transforms into a ram and runs at our screen. Once the other Titans join his attack, the screen breaks, and the segment abruptly ends, only to be immediately replaced by the next segment called 40%, 40%, 20%, in which we learn that Cyborg's strength is derived from a 90s-esque ambient love song that he plays on his internal speakers. After the other Titans are convinced of the song's power, they all transform into overly sexualized or serious versions of themselves. They are also transported to a desert-like plain. Here they ride a 5-person motorcycle. The wind blows dramatically through their hair. A robot hawk and horse travel alongside them, and an impossibly full moon with the face of a wolf looks down upon their adventures. The lesson, as Cyborg puts it, is that, quote, music can transform you. Music is, quote, its own reality. Other explicitly metafictional segments include Season 3's The Art of Ninjutsu, in which the Titans must use their ninja skills to locate the MacGuffin, which turns out to be an Egg McMuffin. And most notably, Season 4 is the self-indulgent 200th episode, Spectacular Part 1 and Part 2, in which the Titans must locate and reanimate their own creators after being confronted by encroaching nothingness, which is a result of production that is halted under the weight of, quote, a very aggressive schedule. These later segments end after the Titans, with real-life photos in hand, track down and reprimand animated versions of Michael Jelenic and Aaron Horvath. Learn the lesson that, quote, make-believe becomes real if you believe it enough, and wonder if, quote, any of this matters, with a montage of Jelenic, Horvath, and the rest of the show's production crew dancing and working on new episodes. Over the montage is the song Work on an Episode, a portion of which, since we've come this far, is worth quoting. Work on an episode, every day, piling on your plate like a work buffet. Get that money for your 401k. Invest in rental property, then work on an episode. It would be easy to disregard Teen Titans Go as nothing other than a popular and diluted to the point of infantilism take on more rigorous forms of postmodern metafiction. In this sense, the show is merely a startling example of how a certain strain or spirit, oh, there they are dancing, sorry, I missed them, and they're working on the episode right there. In this sense, the show is merely a startling example of how a certain strain or spirit of postmodernism has infected our everyday thinking. Its irresponsible lessons in the form of contradictory messages about the infinite pliability of identity and the importance of fighting for one's integrity, to the idea that, quote, make-believe becomes real if you believe in it enough, and that history is never anterior to the form of its telling, now circulate unchecked before the eyes of our children. We can certainly too easily draw a direct line between such messaging and the political consequences of a post-truth crisis. In this specific sense, the show can be viewed as the apotheosis of David Foster Wallace's nightmare. Just think of all that flatulence. A nightmare he outlines in his most influential essay, E Unibus Plurum, Television in U.S. Fiction, published in 1993. As Wallace puts it, quote, television used to point beyond itself. Those of us born in, like, the 60s were trained to look where it pointed, usually at versions of real life, made prettier, sweeter, better, by succumbing to a product or temptation. Today's audience is way better trained, and TV has discarded what's not needed. A dog, if you point at something, will look only at your finger. For Wallace, metafiction is little more than the natural outgrowth of a society that has lost itself to the wonders of televisation, to watching and being watched. We know everything is a self-conscious performance, even if or when we pretend it's not. What then, Wallace asks, do we do when postmodern rebellion becomes a pop cultural institution? His answer, of course, has become as influential as it is problematic. We must become, quote, anti-rebels, born oglers, who dare to back away from ironic watching, who have the childish gall actually to endorse single entendre values, who treat old, untrendy human troubles and emotions in US life with reverence and conviction, who eschew self-consciousness and fatigue. Significantly, and especially in light of his own inability to eschew irony as a narrative tool, Wallace's troublingly masculinist nostalgia in the essay just cited for, quote, sincerity, quote, reverence, quote, authority, and, quote, conviction, predicated as they are on a dismissal of feckless, quote, appeasers, and a privileging of, quote, doers and beers, and those artists who might heroically reverse, quote, television's power to jettison connection and castrate protest, relies upon a potentially strategic confusion of irony and contemporary America's tendency and willingness to vacillate between belief and skeptical incredulity. Irony, in its strictest sense, as someone like Donna Haraway or Richard Rorty might use the term, denotes the sustainment and, via that sustainment, the radical sublation of contradictory positions. Sublation should not here be confused with synthesis. As an English translation of Hegel's Aufhebung, sublation denotes a holding to and a letting go, preservation and abolishment. Synthesis is simply the effacement of difference, a return to depthlessness and indifference, the flattening of ethical distance. Synthesis is not, in fact, dissimilar from sincerity. Whenever I make it possible for my audience to assume that what I say or describe is exactly the same thing as what I mean or what is represented via my description, a troubling sense of depth or distance is negated, and the radical otherness of my meaning or the thing in question is laminated onto or as a given surface. Sincerity, like synthesis, is tantamount to a flat affect. However, irony holds together what is real and what is offered as its representation well or by keeping them at a distance. Irony can draw us toward an engagement with the irony of reality itself, with the in itself as a radically split thing. I mean here a kind of uncanny irony, an irony that is essentially indissoluble from a Lacanian Žižekian real, which gives by barring access, which sustains a connection to reality because it entails contradiction in the most philosophical of senses. Its very nature frustrates Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. Wallace's problem is, in this sense, not irony deployed with care in those texts he calls, quote, complicated ironies, but a tendency to eschew responsibility via recourse to the impossibility of laying claim to stable reference. Irony, in the strictest sense, makes both sincerity and insincerity impossible. The truly ironic claim necessarily bears the unmistakable traces of its own dissembling. Donald Trump, after all, lies so effectively because when he lies most insidiously, he speaks with absolute sincerity. In the wake of postmodernism, then, or rather in the face of postmodernity's ongoing intensification, today's new sincerity, to recall Adam Cowley's influential essay on Wallace, cannot possibly bring us safely to the other side of postmodern irony, nor should we aim for such refuge. In most cases, in fact, recent efforts to locate and endorse a return to sincerity in contemporary aesthetics simply and problematically encourage us to acquiesce to false belief, to the necessity of pretend. What I want to suggest, however, is that to Wallace's central question, if even the president lies to you, whom are you supposed to trust to deliver the real? We would do well to respond today, the ironist. Such an answer might require more support than I can give it in this single talk, but let's, for the moment, assume that irony as a form of sublated dialectical tension or contradiction is far more complicated and far more politically and ethically efficacious than the ability to, in Wallace's words, quote, acquiesce for hours daily to the illusion that people on TV don't know they're being looked at, to the fantasy that we're transcending privacy and feeding on unself-conscious human activity. In doing this, in doing it with the full, if repressed, knowledge that nothing is real any longer, that reality itself is merely a matter of subjective and mutable faith, we are not behaving as ironists. We are simply acquiescing to a pattern of easy and irresponsible oscillation, toggling between belief and skepticism, and thus circumventing the troubling manner in which something real must arrive as the consequence of its corruption, of its essential and perpetual misplacement. Wallace's, quote, postmodern cool simply denotes the position of a character like Lulu in Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, who wantonly asserts that, quote, if I believe, I believe. Who are you to judge my reasons? Let's be clear, though. Wallace is, for the most part, correct in his assessment of late 90s American culture. For only a few years later, with the arrival of reality TV, or contemporary forms of reality TV, we see even more overtly a society's profound and troubling willingness to confuse sincerity with a barely believable lie. And of course, in the case of reality TV, the viewers who watch in rapturous belief are always ready to tell you at any moment with eyes rolled that they know it's not real. And so, we find ourselves in a postmodern or post-truth crisis. As Giles Lipovitsky puts it, while echoing Jürgen Habermas, quote, the heroic will to create a radiant future has been replaced by managerial activism, a vast enthusiasm for change, reform, and adaptation that is deprived of any confident horizon or grand historical vision. The suggestion is that postmodernism has won, and in winning, lost whatever efficacy it once had as an aesthetic movement. Jean-Francois Lyotard's Once radical appeals to fragmentation, moral relativity, and endless narrative play of so many conflicting little stories, forestalling any recourse to a single grand narrative or meta-narrative, now seem for Lipovitsky, quote, vaguely old-fashioned. But Lipovitsky, along with critics like Geoffrey Newlin, seem oddly uninterested in maintaining a clear line between a socio-economic infrastructure and its semi-autonomous cultural effect. The line, that is, that earlier thinkers like Habermas and Linda Hutcheon valiantly struggled to parse. Yet it is precisely the ever more tenuous nature of such a line that allows us to make sense of the seemingly contrary approaches to postmodernism's end or apparent transmutation. How, after all, might we square Newlin and Lipovitsky's sense of postmodernism gone rampant with the various claims that we are now seeing an aesthetic return to truth, sincerity, ethics, etc.? Given these apparently opposed claims, we surely must concede that postmodernism's aesthetic death is paradoxically tied to its societal victory, to its omnipresence as contemporary society's ideological backdrop. That identity is merely an arbitrary discursive effect, or that one truth claim is just as contingent as any other, is simply ubiquitous and endlessly confirmed every time we engage the world via unstable databases, anticipatory search engines, and social media. This is not to suggest that society en masse finally gets postmodernism, that concepts like deconstruction, probably the worst of all of them, what was Trump's advisor, that right-wing guy, they're all, well, anyways, saying that Trump was going to deconstruct the American political system, right? But he means it like deconstructed rabbit, like he's just going to take it apart, you know, or deconstructed sushi or something, right? It just means disassemble in some sort of strange way. Discursive power or performativity, schizoanalysis, the death of the author, all these sort of concepts aren't being employed in popular culture and politics with nuance and care. What I want to suggest, rather, is that the more corrosive implications of postmodernism have fallen in line or come to buttress a socioeconomic trend toward irresponsibility, hyper-individualism, and market-empowering uncertainty. Alternative facts, that kind of stuff. The victory as death of postmodernism has come at the cost of its more subtle implications, its ethical efficacy, its effort to, quote, politicize, as Linda Hutcheon once said, the historical and the factual through a metafictional rethinking of the epistemological and ontological relations between history and fiction. Indeed, to carefully reapproach postmodern aesthetic and philosophical production is, more often than not, to reapproach the manner in which representation of the self, of the past, of the other entails responsibility for two interrelated tasks. One, it must remain true to the outside limits of what cannot be denied, and two, it must signal, in a finite and always contingent construction, that the thing represented, as in Kant's Das Ding, necessarily exceeds the formative moment of its expression. What is lost on or willfully overlooked by any neo-postmodernist who would hope to weaponize postmodern irony as self-serving skepticism is the fact that there is an end to interpretive play, a point at which the real cannot be denied or symbolically evaded, even if it must always be in excess of the frame that momentarily relates it. To counter the intensification of postmodernity and thus the exhaustion of postmodernism's aesthetic efficacy, we must then shift the emphasis from the utter inescapability of the symbolic to the inescapability of a certain ontological gravity, that which necessarily governs, even as it is affected by, our endless failures to grasp it. Neither sincerity nor mere pretend can help us. Let's go back to the utterly unbelievable Teen Titans Go. On some level, it's difficult, if not impossible, to claim that Teen Titans Go is not caught up in the kind of irony Wallace rails against, which is also surely that, quote, one tendency of irony Hegel associates in his lectures on aesthetics with the solipsistic genius of German Romanticism. Nothing is to be taken seriously. Viewers are allowed only to invest themselves in the very lowest of narrative stakes. Moreover, its various metafictional flourishes often seem repetitive to at least a viewer armed with a fair knowledge of postmodern media. However, and at the same time, we would be remiss if we simply conflated the metafiction of Teen Titans Go with every other form of postmodern metafiction, just as I would argue we would be remiss to assume that all metafiction functions in precisely the same manner. While it may still align more readily with our conception of a now stereotyped postmodernism, Teen Titans Go also exemplifies the manner in which the function of metafiction can change from one text to another. Teen Titans Go is never particularly interested in proving that reality is merely the effect of intersubjective and endlessly intersecting discourses. It doesn't function in the same manner as, say, shows like Seinfeld or The Simpsons, which work primarily to frustrate our ability to assert a clear line between actual reality and its subjectification. In Teen Titans Go, however, the metafictional negation of a real anterior to its representation tends to be itself negated. In large part, this is due to the extreme absurdity of the show. The Titans may decide that, quote, make-believe becomes real if you believe it enough, but this trite assertion is sustained as possible only insofar as it is refused. The assertion, in fact, is associated with a sequence in which the Titans meet Aaron Horvath's son, who, since his dad is having a poop, decides to fight the Titans by transforming himself literally into a giant dinosaur. Likewise, music may be able to transform you, but the sheer absurdity of the transformations that ensue, including a scene in which Cyborg transforms into the Transformer Optimus Prime, stress the pure metaphoricity and thus real-life limits of such transformation. Finally, the Titans' freestyling rewrites of history point a la postmodernism to the manner in which historical accounts are invariably the consequence of bias, but their particular accounts cannot be likened to the slippery accounts we see in canonical works of historiographic metafiction, works like Pynchon's Mason and Dixon or Woody Allen's Zelig. In these canonically postmodern texts, a reader or viewer is forced to accept the fact that actual and fictional history are impossible to disentangle. In Teen Titans Go, however, even the youngest viewer is unlikely to believe Beast Boy when he claims that the moon is covered in cheese oceans, and that after flying to the moon in the Apollo Creed, some space dudes needed to be rescued by an old man named Sticky Joe because their, quote, toots were too strong for the moon's gravity. While such a story ostentatiously highlights the fact that historiography can never be taken as pure or purely objective, they also stress the fact that something more true has been irresponsibly obfuscated. In its own childish way, then, the metafiction employed in Teen Titans Go, which is often more of a parody of postmodern metafiction than postmodern metafiction proper, might in fact stand as a subtle sublation of postmodernism, as something un-postmodern. With the un-functioning here like the un in uncanny or undead, it both negates and sustains, ironically, what it perceives. Such a sublation of postmodernism would be, in this sense, neither a simple and nostalgic return to something naively pre-postmodern, nor a matter of irresponsibly oscillating between untenable extremes. This particular mode of overcoming postmodernism, by being, we might say, more postmodern than postmodernism, makes possible a certain experience of the real, a certain affective rupture. It denotes an intuition of the real, intuition that is in the most Kantian of senses. By holding open a traumatic fissure, or enacting what we might think of as a perpetually dehiscing wound between the possibility of saying something in truth and the always corruptive nature of what is actually said, the fissure is paradoxically closed or sutured. A certain postmodern wound is healed, if in fact we are willing to risk saying a bit too much about a show like Teen Titans Go, and I certainly have already. We might even hazard the suggestion that a certain rupture of the unsaid, in a strictly Levinasian sense, is signaled in those moments when the veil of fiction is allowed to seem semi-transparent, when real-life images appear inside the animated frames, when Horvath laments that his work on Teen Titans Go prevents him from spending time with his kids, when we see the tension between creative individuals and an entertainment industry that demands drones forever, quote, working on another episode. These oddly mundane moments remain caught up in the inescapability of the fictional, even as they allow us to grasp certain ineffable truths anterior to their framing. A more serious example of this would be Greg Gillespie's 2017 film, I, Tonya. The film recounts the life of the American figure skater Tonya Harding, up to and slightly beyond the infamous attack on her Olympic rival Nancy Kerrigan. On June 6, 1994, Kerrigan's right leg was struck with a police baton by a man named Shane Stant, who, along with Derek Smith, had been hired to take out Kerrigan by Sean Eckhart. Harding's ostensible bodyguard and a friend of her husband, Jeff Gillooly. The injury prevented Kerrigan from competing at the US Nationals, but she was nevertheless granted a spot on the US Olympic team. She thus went on to compete against Harding and Lillehammer. Kerrigan came in second, Harding 8th, after being granted a reskate due to a problem with her laces. All of these events are well documented, and you can look them up. Google. As an account of these events, the years leading up to them, the film is ostensibly a Hollywood biopic. As such, it begins with an intertitle that stresses its factual nature. However, this intertitle immediately frustrates the very expectations its appearance and typical function in other biopics is likely to provoke. The title explains that what follows is, quote, based on irony-free, wildly contradictory, totally true interviews with Tonya Harding and Jeff Gillooly. Almost too easily, this somewhat disconcerting claim, which appeals to truth and sincerity while embracing contradiction, allows us to position the film within what Lee Constantine terms a post-ironic mode. That is, the film's ironic appeal to irony-free source material should not be overlooked as mere postmodern or perverse irony. The suggestion, even before the often absurd and conflicted narrative gets underway, is that sincere truth claims entail a form of irony. That a certain form of irony is the very possibility of grasping the truth of an event or other, as I've said. If we are to traverse well or by sustaining the distance between an event and its representation, between the other and our apprehension of that other, we must risk an ironic point of relation to and from that event or other. The typical biopic is, in this sense, anti-ironic, utterly insincere because it is as sincere as possible. The true is simply closed off, mortified, no longer permitted to persist in excess of its form. Think of Ron Howard's A Beautiful Mind in 2001, or Morton Teeldum's The Imitation Game in 2015. Or, I mean, there's hundreds of biopics that are just like, this really happened. This guy really cured himself. In such films, the subject, the historical thing, the other is lost to, as it is given to be no different than, the coherence of its narrative account. I, Tonya, however, eschews the often corrosive function of postmodern irony by employing a form of irony that might narrate otherness ethically, that might sublate the truth. First to appear after the inner title is an image of Margot Robbie as Tonya Harding. Facing the camera, she lights a cigarette and prepares to speak. At the bottom of the frame, subtitles confirm that this is Tonya Harding, former Olympic figure skater. The footage is offered in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Combined with the lighting, the immobile camera, and the subtitles, this aspect ratio implies that we are viewing documentary footage, a real interview, or at the very least, if we recognize Robbie, is precise replication. And a lot of people, I think, wouldn't recognize her. But before Harding can speak, similarly styled footage of Sebastian Stan as Jeff Gillooly appears. That's very close, he says, gesturing to the boom mic that is encroached into the frame. Another cut brings us to Alison Janney as an elderly Levana Harding, presented also in interview or documentary format. She tells us, or the unseen interviewer, that, quote, Tonya is her 5th child from husband number 4. As she says this, the film cuts away to what appears to be homemade footage of Harding playing in a yard with her father. The footage is presumably from the 70s, the color is muted, there's evidence of scratches, and the edges are blurred. There's no reason to think it is not real. Even if we know that these people in these previous shots are actors. However, as the film cuts between this footage and the footage of an elderly Levana explaining how difficult Harding could be, Janney, as a young Levana, suddenly appears in frame. We are then given interview footage of, and some comments from, Diane Rawlinson, Tonya Harding's coach, a brief excerpt from an ostensibly real evidence tape of Sean Eckhart, and then interview footage of and introductory comments from Martin Maddox, hard copy editor in 1989 to 98. After another cut back to the interview with Gillooly, in which he comments on how cool it was that his name became a verb, as in to Gillooly someone, we get back to Harding, who is finally allowed to speak. She tells us that she is a real person and not some, quote, old-timey version of what a woman's supposed to be. Her point is that she was never the type of woman the figure skating community was inclined to accept, but she was, quote, the first US woman to land a triple axel. So, she says, fuck 'em. All of this, of course, is a prologue to the actual film. A sound bridge carries us from Harding's somewhat smug fuck 'em to another intertitle, Portland, Oregon, 40 years prior. This bridge is a purely non-diegetic song, Cliff Richard's Devil Woman. When images return, the aspect ratio is changed to 2.391, and the camera tracks fluidly around Lavana and a young Harding. Mother and daughter are standing on an ice ring waiting for Rawlinson. As Lavana gets increasingly aggressive and crudely insistent about Rawlinson taking on the 6-year-old Tanya, the musical cue is carefully synced with the editing, so that the phrase, she's just a devil woman, is ostentatiously coupled with images of Lavana smoking and discarding ash on the ice. Everything about this scene, like the vast bulk of the film in widescreen, is cast as overtly fictional. The non-diegetic and pointedly apropos music, the elegant tracking shots, the precise yet noticeable editing, the lighting and or filtering. This fictionality is doubly accentuated by the documentary footage that precedes it, and yet a striking inversion continues to play out. Since the actors in the overtly fictional diegesis are also the subjects in the documentary footage, even in the apparently homemade footage and the evidence tapes, the undeniable fiction of the Hollywoodized film slowly begins to dissolve the apparent verisimilitude of the opening interviews and the real-life footage. That Harding's interview is initially cut off becomes consequently that much more pointed. Her voice, her very identity, has been, as the film stresses throughout, defined by and then largely buried in a complex layering of fiction, other voices, and physical impositions, her mother's, her husband's, the media's, her fans and detractors, the laws, the US figure skating associations. Viewed backward through the lens of the fictional film, the opening accounts, which serve also to remind viewers of the 2 Tanya Harding documentaries that were released just a few years earlier, are given to be both empirically valid and epistemologically suspect. They are, after all, quote, wildly contradictory. More pointedly, their relationship, or their odd relationship to the fictional diegesis, even at the outset, reminds us that interviewed speakers are never more than actors, the instances of their confessions, mere staging. The initial illusion of extreme verisimilitude is then, if only implicitly, disparaged. The mendacious lie of mimetic closure is placed in antithetical relation to a more ethical negotiation of mimetic distance, and Giluli's odd first line, that's very close, thus takes on a totally different meaning. As the film moves into Tanya's teen years and her first romantic encounters with Giluli, we are encouraged to accept the overt fictionalization of Harding's life as a more sincere access point to the real and its constitutive effects. More sincere, that is, than the ironless interviews and media soundbites that Gillespie frequently invokes. This inversion of fact and fiction, this sublation of the real through fiction, occurs most overtly the first time Gillespie cuts back to the Lavona interview. To hear her tell it, Lavona complains, I would operate on her daily without anesthesia. Please, one fucking time. I hit her one time with a hairbrush. As she says hairbrush, we are given a low-angle shot of Lavona towering over Harding and beating her savagely with a hairbrush. In such moments, the film does not encourage us to take the fictional elements as more real or more objective than its replication of documentary evidence, but neither does it simply reenact a postmodern dismantling of truth claims per se. It works, rather, to demonstrate that the real, as an infinite or plastic thing, and always wholly other, must slip the grasp that holds it, if it is to be held at all, in form. This is what I mean, or what Hegel means, by sublation, paired with Levinas's use of infinity to mean what is not and what is within the finite. The Hegelian notion of sublation is, I want to suggest, a useful way of understanding how a work of art might grasp, in an always finite and contingent form, an ineffable yet affecting truth by sustaining the truth of its ineffability, its perpetual and always strange coming, its endlessly plastic, quote, capacity to, as Catherine Melville puts it, quote, receive form and to produce form, but also to explode that form, or to explode from it. Frequent scenes of Harding being beaten are thus offered as true, but only in their effective contingency. That Harding has, or was, beaten repeatedly by her mother and then by her husband is not to be taken as a matter of discursive construction. The film is clear on this. Harding's experience of abuse, as well as her reciprocal acts of violence, cannot be cast aside as discursive invention or as a matter of perspective. And yet the specifics of these beatings, the real affects of violence, must be apprehended ironically or negotiated across mimetic distance. Otherwise, their devastating affects as events will be ossified, drained to nothing, mortified. The film is, for this very reason, careful to stress its fictionalized nature, even as it affects the sense that its mimetic form can provide a sincere approach to, or the chance to effectively glean, the truth of Harding's life and the events that have come to define it. For instance, the numerous musical cues repeatedly stress that the moments we are seeing are, on some level, performances of a pre-given and popular American script. Norman Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky plays over a scene in which a prepubescent Tanya begs her father not to leave, clearly and falsely, associating him with a utopian escape from her painful life and abusive mother. As his car pulls away, a deep focus shot shows us Lavana on the porch in the background, watching Tanya in the foreground, tearfully watching her father leave forever. The song stresses the manner in which the scene is contingently focalized through Harding's romanticized and song-inflected memory, just as the deep focus suggests that Lavana saw something else altogether, like the fact that Harding has naively idolized a father whose willingness to abandon her is hardly any better than Lavana's cruelty. When Harding first goes on her date with Giluli, Dire Straits' overtly metafictional Romeo and Juliet plays, and then continues over a montage that establishes the defining pattern of their relationship: passionate sex, Giluli's violence, along with Harding's willingness and ability to return that violence, and imprudent moments of reconciliation. Along with the film's numerous other musical cues, these songs place Harding's life within a specific cultural milieu, defined by hard rock depictions of passionate and often violent love affairs and hard-won underdog victories. Indeed, we later see Harding training like, as Harding herself explains, by breaking the fourth wall. Quote, Rocky trained when he had to fight the Russian. She's speaking to the camera there. And as Hart's Barracuda plays over a montage of Harding carrying giant bags of food and water jugs and flipping logs in a forest, the camera repeatedly locates Rawlinson, who then also breaks the fourth wall to note, she actually did this, and this, and this. Such breaks are employed throughout, but in most cases they differ dramatically in form and function from the breaks we get in, say, Ellen's Annie Hall, or John Hughes' Ferris Bueller's Day Off. The first occurs during the dating montage. As Harding and Giluli kiss for the first time, Harding's extra diegetic voice, carried over from the interview, explains that, quote, he was really sweet in the beginning. The next cut brings us to a fight in a truck, and Giluli striking Harding's face, as, in the truck, Harding rubs her cheek. Her voiceover resumes, but then. In the slight pause after then, the fictional Harding turns to the camera and continues. He started hitting me a few months in. She then punches Giluli in the face. From here on, the technique is frequently redeployed to complicate the narrative. At another point, Harding's voiceover transitions into a fourth wall break when, as her face is pressed into a broken mirror, she says, he beat the living shit out of me. She's speaking there to the camera. This break is followed by a cut back to Harding in an interview, who explains with a chuckle that she, quote, thought it was her fault. She goes on to contemplate the absurdity of her story. Quote, Nancy gets hit one time, and the world shits. For me, it's an all-the-time occurrence. Placed between the word time and the word and is a non-diegetic insert, precisely replicated footage of Nancy Kerrigan screaming famously, why? Significantly, this footage is not presented in a 4:3 aspect ratio. The next cut brings us back to the Giluli interview. I never hit her, he insists. That's not me. She hit me, though. The next scene shows Harding chasing Giluli out of a room while cocking a shotgun. Giluli, in voiceover, explains that, quote, she fired a gun at me, too. After firing, Harding turns to the camera to say, quote, this is bullshit. I never did this. and then she cocks the gun again. If, though, the possibility of a non- or extra-diegetic space is negated in these moments in which a documentary reality is pulled into and undermined by an overtly fictional diegesis, this negation is itself negated, to follow again a Hegelian formulation, by the suggestion, established throughout, that the apparent transparency of this documentary reality is simply the fiction that precedes the film. Not surprisingly, then, the interviews become more and more entangled in the filmic diegesis. For instance, after a sudden, mid-sentence cut away from Martin Maddox in Interview, who is explaining how disturbing it was that the classless Harding completed the triple axel to become America's premier figure skater, we see Harding in Interview at the precise moment we begin to hear her. "Could I," she asks the camera, "just interrupt with a quick word about Nancy Kerrigan? It'll just take a sec." This overt reference to the film itself, inclusive now of Maddox's interview, is then mirrored later by Gillooly, and then most strikingly by Lovano, who suddenly returns in Interview to chastise the entire film. "Well, my storyline is disappearing right now. What the fuck?" At this point, the interviews and voiceovers could hardly even be called extra-diegetic. But these overtly metafictional moments do not corrode, as they would in a particularly bombastic postmodern text, the possibility of an ethical and sincere account of the events and the others in question. Instead, the film's careful and progressive dissolution of an ontological line, to use Hutchins' phrasing, most viewers are likely to assume, viewers who might go online to look up real footage or real facts, ultimately reopens the possibility of a radically non-diegetic space, an ineffable chora that is effectively approached via the film's necessarily fictional depictions of violence, abuse, victory, and loss. This is not a matter of simply repudiating the possibility of mimetic efficacy. The film opens up an ethically ironic distance between itself and the events or others it narrates, well, or by embracing a sincere commitment to fidelity. Narrative distance is wrenched open so that it might be traversed in all sincerity. The costuming, hairstyles, sets, and makeup are almost invariably near perfect. This almost uncanny material verisimilitude becomes for most viewers overt when we finally get to what the characters call the incident, and in turn, Harding's final Olympic skate. For the first time, too, real footage is inserted of specifically American journalists like Connie Chung. When, then, Harding is shown approaching the panel of judges in tears so as to explain famously that there is inexplicably a problem with her laces, the film seems as close to Socrates' terrible mimetic lie as it's ever going to get. So in this, the top one there on your left, that's the actual footage. That's Tonya Harding coming up to the judges' panel to show them her laces. That's the replication in the movie. And then this is from the movie as well, this final, the shot at the bottom. But then we see in the TV that he's watching what looks to be, well, you can decide. I'm pretty sure it's the replicated footage, but the convergence, I think, is being played with. It's very hard to tell. If you know a movie like Zelig, this is one of the great postmodern tricks that Woody Allen does, especially at the end with the scene with where Zelig intrudes upon a lecture that Hitler is giving, and Hitler's ranting, and then suddenly there's a commotion in the background, and Hitler actually turns around, and Woody Allen is standing there waving at Eudora Fletcher, his lover, in the audience. And if you look at various scholarship on that movie, no one can agree what's actually happening there, whether that's actually Hitler and they found footage and then inserted Ellen into it, or whether they created the whole scene. But then right when Hitler turns, it cuts to an extremely fictionalized version, the movie version of Zelig's life, and then it's like this ostentatious, like big torches are burning and Hitler's giving this lecture, and it's clearly fake, right? So the idea that this is more real is further compounded, right? So something very similar. And yet in this moment, we are not encouraged to take what we see as simply an accurate rendition of a historical and traumatically effective event. of a particular individual's sublime crisis. We have been positioned instead by everything that precedes this scene to reconsider the original mediation of the event as a form of tragic mortification, the moment when Harding's infinite otherness was fixed forever in the lie of a transparent representation. We are encouraged to endure the distance between this account and the real it struggles to hold in form as best it can. As Harding tells us, the experience of these final events, the media circus that obsessively tracked and framed them, the responses to those frames of fans and detractors, friends and strangers, felt, quote, like being abused all over. Only this time it was by you, all of you. You're my attackers too. Coming as it does toward the end of the film, this accusation implies an overarching aesthetic mandate to endure, in Derrida's phrasing, our profound obligation to protect the other's otherness. To protect a distance we must always hope to overcome. My term for this type of metafiction is historioplastic, which is maybe a too playful play on Hutchins' already playful historiographic metafiction. My goal is to suggest that recent works of metafiction re-engage a type of Hegelian dialectics so as to counter today's perilous intensifications of postmodernism, its entanglement in a post-truth crisis, its co-option by the political right, its misapplication by online pseudo-intellectuals, etc., as Steve Bannon, who I was thinking of. As Zizek has shown repeatedly, Hegel's is not a closed system, even if it can allow us to escape a number of postmodernist traps, as he says. Hegel's is a system that compels us to, and this is Hegel, tarry with the negative, also the title of a Zizek book, to perpetually endure the, quote, strenuous effort of the notion that is of a divine or infinite reality, what Hegel calls spirit. What allows us in Hegel to apprehend this infinite real is paradoxically, or in the finite real, is paradoxically the willingness to endure the failure to do so. It is the experience of such a failure that finally signals the ethical sustainment of what cannot, not with justice at least, be contained in the finite, in the coherence of a momentary and contingent form of representation. The dialectical movement of spirit does not end for Hegel in closure. It is ironically sublated the moment its paradoxically infinite end is signaled and sustained in a coherent expression or thought, like Christ's divinity in what Hegel calls romantic art. The strenuous effort of the notion entails then grasping, but never ossifying, the infinite plasticity of the real. Plasticity being, as Malibu demonstrates, the central concept that haunts Hegel's entire project. In no way is this a matter of pretending, sustaining unjustifiable beliefs, or engaging in impulsive meta-modern oscillations between irony and sincerity, even if, or precisely because, such oscillations have come to define our present postmodern society, especially in politics and the so-called fake media. A film like I, Tonya shifts the emphasis from symbolic artifice to the infinite real that must perpetually escape its symbolization. As a form of irony, it refuses the violence of mimesis, while at the same time striving again to touch, as affectionately as possible, the truth.